degree of support from the West for Ukraine remains quite strong. President Biden's trip to Ukraine provided reassurance, and of course, most of the key European leaders have also been there. So where we are now is there is likely to be a Ukrainian counteroffensive sometime this spring. The Russians are undertaking an offensive now, but it looks like it's a pretty minor affair. The West wants to be sure that Ukraine can be successful in the counteroffensive and is providing more weapons and intelligence to support that. So I think right now the issue is being helpful to Ukraine, encouraging a quicker end to the war if possible, but that means a victory for Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. And Downing Street has been doing some briefing today, and some of it is covered on the front page of the Times and the Telegraph, which tells us that Mr. Sunak is going to tell the G7 virtual meeting tomorrow that world leaders need to seize a, quote, window of opportunity to help Kiev regain territory. He thinks that they need a decisive advantage on the battlefield, and that is what it will take to shift Vladimir Putin's mindset. How wide do you think that window of opportunity is?
That's hard to know. It certainly will be several months, and this is why it's important for countries to provide tanks and other armored personnel vehicles, infantry fighting vehicles to Ukraine, because an offensive is more complex than a defensive. An offensive requires combined arms operations, which are armor, infantry, artillery, and aviation working together. And only recently has the West agreed to provide tanks to Ukraine. So helping Ukraine get that armor in place will be very important for conducting that counteroffensive.
Mm-hmm. I see that the U.S. President Joe Biden is going to announce a new wave of sanctions against Russia. How effective do you think the sanctions have been thus far? And will the Russians really be worried about further sanctions?
Well, I think the European Union and the United States probably tomorrow are going to be announcing new sanctions. The sanctions are devices, instruments that have accumulating impact. So at the beginning, for example, with regard to supplies of semiconductors, the Russians will already have some stocks of those. But as time goes on, the semiconductor shortage is going to be worse for Russia. Impacts in other sectors are going to be important. In the automobile sector, for example, production in Russia has declined by over 50% over the last year because of shortages of parts. Almost all the major manufacturing, extractive, and transportation companies in Russia depend on the West for either equipment, technology, services, or software updates. And so there are powerful levers that are going to have cumulative impact over time. So I think it's too soon to judge the impact of the sanctions yet on the various sectors. And then with regard to the economy, the GDP of Russia hasn't gone down quite so much, but that's because the Russian government is spending out of its accumulated wealth to prop up the GDP. That impact is on GDP is going to have a greater effect in the next couple of years.
What then of Chinese attempts to say to Russia, there is no limit to the strength and depth of our partnership? They sent their top diplomat to see President Putin, and there's talk of them supplying weapons, and the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, is considering releasing that data. Would that be wise, and what do you think it could achieve?
Well, as it turned out, releasing public data before the war started last year turned out to be quite effective in helping to marshal support in the West for Ukraine and helping the Ukrainians to be prepared for the onslaught.
But it didn't stop the Russians crossing the border, did it, in huge numbers?
I'm sorry?
But it didn't stop the Russians. I mean, if that was the intention,
no,
it didn't stop the Russians crossing the border.
But it helped the Ukrainians defeat them at the beginning. Remember, the Russians tried to seize the three largest cities in Ukraine at the beginning, Kiev, Kharkiv, and Odessa, and didn't manage to seize any one of the three. So I think there's a feeling in Washington that releasing more information publicly can also help marshal Western opinion, and that could be helpful. Now, the Chinese, it should be said, while there may be concern about threatening to supply lethal weapons. The Chinese have been warning Russia not to go nuclear, not to use nuclear weapons. In Samarkand last fall, Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi both warned Putin not to do that. And just a couple of days ago in the Munich Security Conference, Wang Yi, the top Chinese diplomat, also warned Russia not to go nuclear. So China's role has been mixed in this, but we shouldn't overlook both aspects.
Yeah. Talking of nuclear and Vladimir Putin, I mean, he said earlier today that he would, quote, focus on strengthening the nuclear triad. And the Daily Telegraph interprets that as meaning Moscow's nuclear weapons that can be fired from land, air, or sea. Are these empty threats just a gesture?
The Russians have been modernizing their nuclear forces in recent years, probably spending too much money because the utility for them militarily for that has not been very high. President Putin has continued to use nuclear rhetoric. In 2018, you may recall, he showed a graphic video of a nuclear cruise missile hitting Florida, close to Mar-a-Lago, where President Trump's house was. So using this, if you will, boasting about nuclear arms is a practice that Putin is enamored with. But there's no sign that Russia is close to doing that. And again, with Chinese and Indian warnings, I think Putin would think twice.
Yeah, I see that President Zelensky is keen to meet Chinese representatives. I mean, they prepared a peace plan, in quotes, without any input from his government. Make of that what you will. But let's pivot from that, William, to the vote earlier today at the UN Security Council, the UN. 141 countries voting for a resolution that Russia should immediately and unconditionally withdraw its troops from Ukraine. 32 abstained, including, interestingly, China and India, and 7, Russia, of course, Belarus, Syria, North Korea, Mali, Nicaragua, and Eritrea opposed. What to make of that, particularly that 141 countries voted in favor and 32, among the 32 that abstained, China and India?
Well, this is not the first UN General Assembly vote that's been lopsided in favor of pressing Russia to pull out of Ukraine. There was a vote some months earlier where I think about 150 or so countries voted for that as well. The abstention by China and India is not really a surprise. China is trying to duck low on this issue, and India has also been wanting to avoid offending Russia too much. But clearly the international sentiment is in favor of Russia's pulling out of Ukraine.
Yeah, can we, I don't know if you're a spiritual man, William, but I'm going to quote a spiritual guy, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, the leader of the Anglican Communion, and he says that Russia should not be treated like Germany was after the First World War. It should be allowed to recover. It shouldn't be unduly punished, and it should not be humiliated. How would you respond to that?
Well, there's been a couple of Western leaders also who said that Russia should not be humiliated, perhaps defeated, but not humiliated. It is unclear the extent to which Russia is going to be committing atrocities in this war. You know, we've already seen in Bucha and some other places really shocking atrocities. If Russian forces continue to do that, there's going to be stronger pressure in the West to make Russia pay a price, and that could include seizure of Russian central bank assets that are in Western banks and using those assets to help fund reconstruction in Ukraine. There could be other measures as well, including keeping sanctions on. In the case of Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, the West used both pressure and EU incentives to cause the Yugoslavs or the Serbians to give up Milosevic to international tribunal. So a number of these things still lie in the future. It's not clear what humiliation is, but certainly the defeat of Russia and its withdrawal from all of Ukraine is a target that now pretty much has acceptance in the West.
Right. Just thinking about the people of Ukraine, many of whom are in this country and in countries across Europe, they've sought sanctuary, but think there are many millions who are still in the country. And some of our newspapers have quoted the figure of 100,000 civilian deaths 1 year on. However this conflict ends, William, it's going to be very difficult for Ukrainians to trust their giant neighbour, isn't it, in the future?
Yes, the war on Ukraine has jeopardized Russia's relations with Ukraine for decades or maybe centuries to come. It was a strategic blunder by Russia. The Ukrainians, like the Belarusians and the Russians, are all East Slavs, and the predominant number of Ukrainians are of the Orthodox faith, as is the case in Russia and Belarus. So for Russia to use this shocking amount of force and commit these atrocities against a country whose people are so close to Russia in many other ways really has been an eye-opener and a huge